Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about, uh, a really dark chapter of American history, slave breeding. You sent over this YouTube video titled 10 Facts About Slave Breeding That Schools Failed to Teach You. And it's from a channel called Black Culture Unlocked. Now, I know what you might be thinking, YouTube. Not exactly the first place that comes to mind when you're looking for, serious historical research, but this video, it actually presents a pretty unique perspective on a topic that a lot of, standard history books just kind of gloss over.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's often left out of the mainstream narrative.
Yeah.
And it's a shame because it's so crucial to understanding the full scope of the horrors of slavery.
Right. So today we're going to kind of dig into some of the
Uh,
facts. Understand how slave breeding, it went way beyond just economics.
right. It was about power and control. It was about dehumanizing an entire group of people to the point where you could justify treating them like livestock.
Exactly. And we're also going to explore the lasting legacy that this system has had on Black communities. Even today, it's heavy stuff.
It is.
But it's really important for us to understand, the roots of the social injustice that we're still grappling with.
Absolutely. And it's about connecting the dots between the past and the present.
Hmm.
Recognizing how deeply the legacy of slavery is woven into the fabric of American society.
Yeah, and the video really starts off strong talking about that systematic dehumanization of Black people and how that was really the foundation for this whole system. It's crazy because slave breeding, it wasn't just about forced labor.
No, it was about so much more than that.
It was about controlling like every single aspect of their lives, their bodies, their families,
Their very identities.
their identities. It's just mind-blowing.
Absolutely. And there's this one detail in the video that just sends chills down my spine. They talk about how slave children were literally listed in ledgers right alongside livestock and crops.
It's like they were just another commodity, another piece of property.
Not people.
Yeah, not people. It makes you wonder, how could anyone treat another human being this way?
Well, the video creator argues that this level of cruelty was only possible through a process of deliberate dehumanization. If you can strip away someone's humanity, it becomes a lot easier to justify exploiting them.
Right, it's like you're removing their personhood.
Exactly.
And it's disturbing to think about how that dehumanization continues to echo through history, like shaping perceptions of Black people even today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can see those echoes in everything from racist stereotypes to disparities in healthcare and education.
Yeah, it's still so prevalent. And, we often learn about the abolition of the international slave trade in 1808 as this positive turning point, right? Like slavery is coming to an end. But the video you shared, it highlights this truly disturbing consequence. It actually fueled slave breeding within the United States.
It's a tragic irony, really. When the supply of enslaved Africans was cut off, plantation owners had to find another way to maintain their workforce. And tragically, they turned to the forced reproduction of the people they already enslaved.
So instead of, ending the barbarity, it just shifted the focus to a different form of exploitation.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
And what's even more unsettling is how enslaved women became even more valuable. I mean, invaluable in this context is just such a twisted term.
Right, it takes on a whole new meaning when you're talking about human beings as property.
To their enslavers because of their ability to give birth.
It's like they were walking wombs. The video actually states that a woman who could produce strong children, she could be worth twice as much as a skilled male laborer.
Wow.
It's a horrifying example of how economic incentives were driving this practice.
It's sickening. And that kind of leads us into, those forced mating practices that the video describes. Just the idea of reducing human beings to studs and forcing them to father children. I mean, it's hard to even process.
It's beyond comprehension, really.
Huh?
And the video emphasizes that these weren't just random pairings. Plantation owners meticulously selected enslaved people, based solely on physical attributes that they thought would produce strong, healthy offspring, like they were breeding horses or cattle.
Yeah, you're just looking for desirable traits.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just another way they stripped away any sense of agency or consent from these people, reducing them to mere commodities.
And of course, we can't forget about the families.
Right, the countless families that were ripped apart by this system,
Children sold away from their mothers, husbands and wives separated.
all to maximize profit and maintain control.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the emotional toll this must have taken.
Absolutely. The psychological trauma of those separations. It's something that reverberates through generations even today.
Yeah, the impact is still felt. And it's important to remember that this separation wasn't just some, accidental byproduct of the system.
No, it was a deliberate tactic.
Like a calculated move to break their spirits.
Exactly. to prevent uprisings, to reinforce the idea that these people were property, not human beings.
It's awful. And this leads us to another disturbing aspect of this system that I think we need to talk about. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women.
It's a difficult topic to discuss.
It's
But it's essential to understanding the full scope of the horrors that were inflicted upon these people.
Yeah, we can't shy away from it. And the video points out that owners, overseers, any white man in a position of power, they could force themselves on these women without any fear of consequence.
And this violence, it wasn't just rooted in power and control, it was also driven by this perverse logic of seeing these women as nothing more than vessels for producing more enslaved people.
It's just unimaginable to think about the trauma that these women endured.
And you know what's even more disturbing? Is that this wasn't just some unspoken practice. There were actual laws in place that enshrined slave breeding into the legal framework of the United States.
Oh, right. The video mentions the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum,
Exactly.
which basically meant that the status of a child followed that of the mother.
So if a woman was enslaved, any child she bore was automatically enslaved as well, regardless of who the father was.
So it didn't matter if the father was a white slave owner.
Nope. Those children were still born into slavery.
It's crazy to me that this was enshrined in law.
It really shows how deeply entrenched slavery was in American society. These laws weren't just about regulating behavior. They were about maintaining white supremacy and the economic system that was built on the backs of enslaved people.
Yeah, it was all interconnected. But you know what's amazing is that even in the face of this unimaginable oppression, the people who endured it, they found ways to resist.
That's the thing about the human spirit.
Yeah.
It's incredibly resilient,
Yeah, they were not going to be broken.
no matter how hard their oppressors tried.
So let's talk about that next. Let's dive into the ways that enslaved people resisted and fought back against the system, because their stories are truly incredible.
They are,
Yeah.
and they deserve to be heard.
So we've talked about like the absolute horrors of this whole slave breeding system, but I kind of want to shift gears a bit and focus on something that I thought was really amazing that the video you shared kind of pointed out, and that's the resilience of the people who actually like lived through this. What were some of the ways that they resisted and fought back against this just dehumanizing system?
We had to remember that resistance took a lot of different forms. You know, some of them were very like in your face and defiant,
Right.
and others were much more subtle ways of like preserving their humanity and their culture.
Yeah, like little acts of rebellion.
Exactly.
The video mentions the use of herbal knowledge to control fertility. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is actually a fascinating example. Enslaved women, they used certain plants that they had knowledge of, passed down through generations, to induce miscarriages or even prevent pregnancies altogether.
It's incredible to think about the courage that must have taken,
Right.
knowing the potential consequences.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
was a huge risk.
Huge.
But it was a way for them to exert some control over their own bodies and their reproductive destinies in a system that was specifically designed to deny them that control.
Yeah, to take that power away from them.
Completely.
And it also speaks to like the depth of their knowledge and the importance of those traditions that they managed to hold on to, even in the face of all this oppression.
Right. They were drawing on ancient wisdom and using it as a tool of resistance.
That's so cool.
It really is. And it wasn't just about these individual acts of defiance either. The video also talks about escape as a form of resistance.
Yeah, I can't even imagine having to make that choice, like stay and risk having your children sold away. Or risk everything for a chance at freedom, knowing that you might never see your loved ones again.
It was a gamble with incredibly high stakes.
Yeah.
But for many, it was a risk worth taking.
And it's important to remember, too, that escape wasn't just about individual freedom. A lot of times it was about trying to protect their families from being torn apart by this system, by this deliberate breeding and selling of children.
Right.
For profit.
Exactly. It was about survival, both for themselves and for their loved ones.
And those journeys, they were fraught with danger.
Oh, absolutely.
But they represent this incredibly powerful testament to the human desire for freedom.
And to the deep love that these people had for their families.
Yeah. Just incredible bravery.
And they often had to rely on networks of support, what we often refer to as the Underground Railroad.
Right.
Which is a testament to communal resistance.
Absolutely. And speaking of communal resistance, the video also highlights how important that was. You know how enslaved people supported and protected each other? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Despite the constant threat of separation and punishment, there was this incredible sense of solidarity among enslaved people. They would share information about safe routes for escape, pass on knowledge about herbal remedies, and just generally find ways to care for each other, even in the most horrible of circumstances.
It's amazing how, even in the face of all that brutality, community and connection could not only survive, but actually thrive.
It's a testament to the human spirit.
Yeah. And we can't talk about resistance to slave breeding without talking about the impact on Black motherhood. The video kind of touched upon the challenges that these women faced, but I'd love to hear you expand on that a little bit. Like, what was it like for them to know that any child that they brought into this world could be taken away from them?
Oh, it's just an unimaginable reality to even try to comprehend. To be forced to bear children into a system that saw them as property, to know that those children could be ripped away from you at any moment,
Yeah.
to be sold, to be traded. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it defies description.
Motherhood became this site of both profound love and just agonizing loss for these women.
It must have taken like a superhuman level of emotional strength and resilience
Yeah.
to even function.
And yet, even within that horrific system, they resisted in so many ways. Some mothers would secretly teach their children about their heritage and their culture, instilling a sense of identity and pride, even in the face of dehumanization.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. Others would risk punishment to just spend a few precious moments with their children, to create memories, to forge connections that couldn't be easily broken.
Those little moments of joy must have been like just little glimmers of light in all that darkness.
They were. And even when families were separated, there was this unwavering determination to keep those family bonds alive, to pass down stories and traditions, and to hold on to that hope of reunion.
It's really a testament to the enduring power of family and the deep love that existed within those communities, despite the best efforts of the slave system to just completely destroy them.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the trauma of those separations didn't just vanish with the end of slavery. The psychological scars left by forced breeding and family separation, they still reverberate through generations. They still impact family structures and relationships in Black communities even today.
It's like another way that the legacy of slave breeding continues to cast a shadow over the present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's why it's so important for us to acknowledge this history, to understand it, so that we can work towards healing and justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of legacies, the video really drove home the point that slave breeding has been systematically erased from our mainstream historical narratives. Like, it's almost as if there's been this deliberate effort to try to downplay the horrors of slavery, to shield people from the true extent of the suffering that Black people endured. Why do you think that is?
That's a really complex question. But I think part of it stems from a desire to maintain a certain narrative about American history, a narrative that often glosses over the more unpleasant aspects of our past
Mm.
and downplays the systemic nature of racism and oppression.
Right, like it's a very sanitized version of history.
Exactly. It's like trying to tell a story without acknowledging the villains or the victims.
And that kind of selective storytelling, it allows for this distorted understanding of the past,
It does.
which makes it much harder to address the systemic inequalities that we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. It's like trying to solve a problem without understanding its root cause.
Yeah, you might be able to treat the symptoms, but the underlying issue remains.
Precisely.
And that's why I think the work that's being done by so many scholars and activists and descendants of enslaved people to reclaim these erased narratives is so incredibly important.
It is.
They're shining a light on the truth,
Yeah.
forcing us to confront the full scope of the brutality that was inflicted.
And challenging us to reckon with the lasting impact of those atrocities.
It's a process of historical reckoning that can be really painful and uncomfortable,
It can be.
but it's absolutely essential for healing and progress.
I couldn't agree more.
And it's not just about the past.
No, it's not.
Understanding the history of slave breeding helps us to connect the dots to so many issues that we're still grappling with today, like mass incarceration, reproductive rights, the ongoing struggle for racial justice.
It's all interconnected.
It really is.
And it's a reminder that history isn't just something we study in textbooks. It's something we live with, and within
yeah, it shapes our present.
in countless ways.
And we have a responsibility to learn from it, to challenge it,
Yeah.
and to work towards creating a more just and equitable future.
Absolutely.
I think that's a perfect segue to the final part of our deep dive, where we're going to explore those lasting impacts a little bit further and how they continue to shape our world today.
Wow, we've covered some really tough stuff in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
The dehumanization, the forced breeding, families ripped apart. It's hard to believe that this all happened.
In our own country.
In our own country, not that long ago, really, when you think about it.
It's a stain on our history.
It really is, but what I think is really striking is how the legacy of this whole slave breeding system, it's not just something, from the past. It continues to impact us even today.
Oh, absolutely. The echoes of that system, they're still present in so many aspects of our society.
It's like you said earlier,
Yeah.
a wound that never fully healed.
And it just keeps festering beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the video that you shared, it actually makes this direct connection between slave breeding and the ongoing struggle for reproductive rights, which honestly is not something I had ever really considered before. But when you think about it, the parallels are kind of undeniable.
They are. It's about control. It's about bodily autonomy.
Exactly.
When you consider the history of slave breeding, where Black women were completely denied any control over their bodies, any reproductive choices, it adds this whole other layer to the conversation around abortion, contraception, bodily autonomy in general.
Yeah, it really reframes that whole fight for reproductive justice, especially for Black women. It's not just about access to healthcare.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming a fundamental right that was denied to them for centuries.
Absolutely. And it highlights the need for policies and practices that empower women, particularly women of color, to make their own decisions about their bodies without fear of judgment or coercion.
Yes, 100%. And another area where I see a really clear connection to this past is in the mass incarceration system.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The video talks about how slave breeding really contributed to the dehumanization of Black men, reducing them to just their physical attributes.
Right. Their potential for labor.
It stripped them of their humanity, their individuality, their very souls.
And sadly, those ideas, they haven't disappeared.
No, they haven't.
They've just morphed and adapted over time.
Yeah.
Feeding into the racial disparities that we see in policing, in sentencing, and in incarceration rates today.
It's like a direct line from slavery to Jim Crow to the mass incarceration era. It's all connected.
It is. And until we acknowledge that historical context and address it head on, we're just going to keep seeing these patterns repeat themselves over and over again.
And I think that's a really important point. The system isn't broken. It was designed this way.
Yeah, exactly.
We also can't ignore the economic legacy of slave breeding. Generations of unpaid labor, wealth built on the backs of enslaved people. It all adds up to this staggering economic disparity that we're still grappling with today.
All right, and Black families have been systematically denied access to the same economic opportunities as white families.
Yeah.
For generations.
Housing, education, business loans, inheritance. It's hurdle after hurdle.
And when you factor in the intentional destruction of families during slavery, it's no surprise that many Black communities are still struggling to achieve economic stability.
The systemic barriers are just immense.
And they're directly tied to this history of exploitation and oppression.
So where do we go from here? What can we do with this knowledge? I mean, it can feel really overwhelming, to be honest.
It can be. But I think the first step is awareness. Confronting this history, no matter how painful it might be, it's crucial to understanding the root causes of the inequalities that we see all around us.
Yeah, education is key.
It is.
Shining a light on these dark chapters, having honest conversations about the past, and how it shakes our present.
Exactly, and it's about connecting the dots, looking at current issues like mass incarceration, reproductive rights, economic disparities, and recognizing how they're all linked to this history of oppression.
We need to see that through line.
We do.
Those patterns that have persisted for centuries.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have that understanding. Then what? How do we actually start to dismantle these systems that are so deeply ingrained in our society?
It's a huge challenge. There's no easy answer. But I think it starts with individual accountability, examining our own biases, our own privileges, and challenging injustice wherever we see it.
So it's about personal reflection as much as it is about systemic change.
Exactly.
We all have a role to play.
We do.
And it's also about amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized and silenced for so long.
Yes, lifting up the voices of those who have been historically oppressed.
Supporting organizations that are fighting for social justice.
And working to create a more equitable society.
And that's why I think resources like this video that you shared, they're so incredibly valuable. They make this information accessible.
They spark these important conversations.
Exactly. And hopefully they inspire people to take action.
It's about reclaiming our history, honoring the resilience of those who endured these horrors, and using that knowledge to build a better future.
It's a heavy task, but it's one that we absolutely must undertake. This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least.
It has been heavy.
Thank you for sharing this video with me and for guiding us through this conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, remember, understanding the past isn't about dwelling in it, it's about learning from it.
And using those lessons to create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
And on that note, we're going to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If slave breeding was all about controlling and commodifying Black bodies, how does that history inform our understanding of issues that we're facing today, like genetic testing, surveillance technologies, and the increasing privatization of healthcare? Those are some really thought-provoking questions.
They are. There are no easy answers. But I think it's important for us to at least start asking them. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive. And as always, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.